Hello and welcome to Week 11 of FINA H111, History of Art 1, Prehistory to Medieval. This is a course being presented by Indiana University, Purdue University of Fort Wayne. I'm Dr. Aaron Schwartz, and our topic for this week is Early Medieval Europe. So to help us understand where we are in the timeline, we'll take a look at this chart. The area encircled in blue is roughly the time period that we'll be looking at this week, and you'll notice that that overlaps with the lectures that we've had over the past couple of weeks with the Byzantine Empire and the rise of early Islamic empires. So all of this is happening contemporaneous with the things that we have been discussing over the past couple of weeks. What we're going to be doing this week is looking at the early medieval era of Western and Northern Europe. Basically everything in Europe that we haven't talked about yet. Everything west of Byzantium and west of the Constantinople after the great split after the fall of the Roman Empire. Most of Western Europe fell into what we now call the Dark Ages or the medieval times, and this is the time period we're going to be concentrating on in this week's discussion. So let's start by looking at this map and getting an idea of where we are geographically. Of course, you can see Rome in Italy, and then everything north of that. We'll be jumping around different places in Northern and Western Europe. So we're talking about the artwork and cultures that arise after the fall of Rome. We want to consider the fall of Rome roughly around the year 410. After that formal collapse of the political structure in Rome, we'll have various different European ethnic groups, the Huns, the Vandals, the Franks, the Goths, the Vikings, and other non-Roman groups that will begin to compete with each other over land and resources across Europe. These battles and these struggles between these groups will eventually form into what we think of as the medieval kingdoms of Europe, France and England and Spain and so on. So we'll be moving around quite a bit through the north and western part of Europe. You'll see a few of the sites that we'll be looking at: Hildesheim in Germany, Ernest in Norway, Sutton Hoo over in England. And what we're looking at here is the layout of what Western Europe was like after the collapse of Rome. What we will notice is that unlike the Byzantine Empire, which had a nice, strong, centralized government and centralized church authority, Western Europe doesn't have that. After the collapse of Rome, there will be several attempts to try to unify European peoples under one banner and under one Christian banner. There's a great deal of missionary work trying to Christianize people of Europe, but it doesn't really come together as a unit until roughly the year 800 or so with a guy named Charlemagne. Now, before we get to Charlemagne, though, let's take a look at the artwork being produced prior to that unification. So what we'll see being made across Europe during this time period, before major emperors like Charlemagne come about, Europe is going to be pretty much organized under a series of sort of small kings, tribal leaders from these different ethnic groups that are competing with each other. Excuse me. For the most part, what we'll have in terms of artwork and artifacts from this time period, particularly up in the north, are not really large works of architecture. We'll have lots of ship decoration and lots of personal items like what you're seeing here. Something like this. These are a pair of fibulae. We saw fibulae, if you remember, all the way back to the Etruscans. They were quite famous for their very elaborate gold work. A fibulae is basically a pin or a clasp that would have been used on clothing. And that's what we're seeing here, a pair of those items. Now, what we will notice in this area across Europe, across many different cultures and ethnic groups, is a tendency toward zoomorphic forms and complex interlaced design. Whether you're Merovingian, Hiberno-Saxon, Viking, whatever the ethnic group tends to be, we'll see a tendency towards that kind of complexity of design that we see here. These two fibulae are only about 4 inches long, so there's an incredible amount of detail and craftsmanship packed into these small objects. But these objects would have been made for somebody of a very high status or class, perhaps even our chief or king, of one of these smaller ethnic groups. We'll see a similar kind of design here in this purse cover. This was found in a burial site in Sutton Hoo. And what we'll see, this dates to about the year 625. A combination of gold, glass, and enamel, cloisonné with garnets and emeralds, so it's an extremely precious object with a great deal of precious stones and metals within it. The entire thing is only about 7.5 inches long, and as a purse cover, it's exactly that. It's a hinged cover that would have been on top of probably a leather purse where a person would have kept precious items, coins, money, that sort of thing. We'll notice in the decoration on this piece these wonderful zoomorphic and human forms that are completely interlaced together. And this is something that we today usually associate with Celtic art, and there's definitely a Celtic influence at Sutton Hoo. But the interlaced design is not unique to the Celts. It's something that we see across Northern European peoples during this particular time period. Now we should note there are Roman Christian missionaries coming into these lands, into the north and into the west, trying to convert people to Christianity. And I want to mention that at this point because we'll begin to see the incorporation of imagery like this, which has ancient pagan roots, being incorporated into Christian contexts. And that will be something that will allow Christian missionaries during this time period to become successful throughout Europe. It's a process of conversion that is very adaptable. Missionaries are coming into Celtic or Viking or different areas, different cultural areas, and they're adapting the lessons of Christianity to the artwork that the pagan people are already making. And it becomes very flexible and adaptable in that way. As we look at this piece in particular, there's nothing here that strikes us as being explicitly Christian in its motif, and this is probably coming from a more traditional viewpoint, and the stories being told here, the narrative is probably something relating to the chief, to our king, his lineage. These are most likely totems of his family and his control. Now this was found with a ship burial site in Suffolk, England. Suffolk, where this is found, is not on the coast, so this was not a ship burial like a burial at sea. What we find very often in these locations, particularly in England and Ireland, is that a chief or some other incredibly important member of society would be buried in a ship in the ground. They would put his body, all of his weapons and valuables and gold and precious items like this would all be heaped into a good-sized boat, a good-sized ship, and then the entire object would be buried in the earth. So we clearly see that connection to the sea is important, even if we're not burying that person at sea and sinking the ship off of the coast. Speaking of ships and ship masts and the kind of decoration we might see associated with that, this is an animal head post from a ship burial, similar to what I just described. This one's found in Norway, so most likely it has Viking roots to it. We'll see that it's a highly stylized animal head with big staring eyes, and some of the teeth still remain. A little hard to determine exactly what animal it's supposed to be, but you see this really deep, extremely intricate interlace work design encircling the head of the animal. Now, it's a little difficult for us to decipher the meaning of the interlace work. We think it has something to do with being a symbol of everlasting life, the cycles of nature, and so on. But again, this is a very predominant decorative motif across Northern Europe. Many different European peoples practice this kind of decorative motif. By the time we get to the year 1000, most of Europe has been Christianized, has been converted to Christianity, even as far north as Scandinavia. And what we're looking at here is a doorway, a portal, from the Stave Church at Ørnes in Norway, dating from about 1050 to 1070. So while this does come from a Christian church, the rest of the church, by the way, no longer exists. We just have a few items left. What we're going to see that even though this was a Christian church, this is a very Viking motif, and a very traditional ancient motif that the Scandinavians would have used, being incorporated into this Christian church's door. And what we're seeing happening here, as I mentioned, early Christian missionaries to this part of the world, they're not like the Christian missionaries of the early part of the church close to Rome and close to the security of the interior of the empire. When you get all the way up into Norway, all the way over to England and Ireland, this is the frontier. This is way out beyond the comfortable and protected areas of the interior empire. When missionaries make their mission to go out to these places to try to convert the people, they're often talking to people who are not amenable to that message. They have no interest in Christianity. They certainly have no interest in the Roman Empire or the legacy of the Roman Empire. So missionaries, in some cases, do run across quite a bit of resistance. So instead of coming in with Roman legionnaires or coming in heavy-handed and trying to force populations to convert, they take a more subtle tack with it, preaching in the local language, trying to incorporate the local traditional artwork into a Christian context. And that's exactly what we're seeing here with this work. So the doorway is our entrance into the church, but we see it surrounded by this traditional Viking interlace motif. We're going to see various animals and other zoological forms and plant forms. Occasionally we will see something that is indicative of a grapevine or grapes, and that's going to be a desire on the part of the Christians and the missionaries in this area to make associations to the Eucharist and the blood of Christ. The idea of the interlace work itself becomes a metaphor for eternal life and eternal renewal, and the idea of death and resurrection. And we'll find that missionaries in this area in this time will use the native art and will use the traditional artwork of the area as a way to help explain and gain entrance into that society to explain Christian ideals. Now, once they're established enough to create churches like the one where this door was, we'll see the production of more explicitly Christian symbols and items, and in particular throughout the northern part of Europe, we're going to see the production of a great deal of manuscripts. It becomes an important part of Christianity spread across this part of Europe. Alright, so I've mentioned Ireland a couple of times. Let's take a look at what's happening over there. So this is a carpet page from a manuscript called the Book of Durrow, dating to about 660 to 680 or so. And it's pretty indicative of this Hiberno-Saxon era and the type of artwork that's being produced there. Now we call it Hiberno-Saxon because Ireland back in this time was known by its Latin name, or at least Roman missionaries knew it by its Latin name, Hibernia. That's not what the native Irish called it. And then the other major ethnic group in the region were, of course, the Saxons. This type of artwork is also sometimes referred to as insular. But what we'll see are large monasteries that begin to develop for the purpose of creating these kinds of documents and these kinds of manuscripts. These are usually Gospels, so they'll contain the book of the Gospels themselves, and very often each Gospel book will be introduced with a page like this. This is the symbol of St. Matthew, and so this indicates that we're beginning the book of Matthew here. Now what we'll notice with this is that any sort of classical Roman Greek realism, proportion, perspective, all of those things we associated with the Greco-Roman classical world, it is completely gone here. You see that figure of a man, he is completely flat, he is utterly abstract, completely reduced down to geometric shape. Now we see a great deal of variety of line and texture within that interlace work border that surrounds him. So we need to be careful that we don't just dismiss this as, an unskilled artist, an untrained artist. No, certainly this is an artist that is very skilled and very well trained, but what we don't have native to this region is that tradition of classical realism. That's just not something that the local people who have probably been converted and recruited to work within the scriptoriums making these, that's not a part of their tradition. So what we're seeing here, again, is that adaptation of local Celtic art into these Christian books, into these Gospels, to beautify them, and to create something that will be more familiar to the local community. When the preachers and the missionaries are trying to spread the word and trying to spread this religion, they can use these books and show people artwork that's already kind of familiar to them, that's not going to be too bizarre or off-putting to them. So there are a lot of reasons we're incorporating Celtic work into these Christian contexts. Another example can be seen here from the Lindisfarne Gospels. This is a carpet page, and if you look at it carefully, you can see that it is a cross on being surrounded by a rectangular border. And the only thing that really differentiates the cross from the background, besides that sort of red-maroon line, is the difference in color. And I don't know how well you guys can see this in this video, but if you got really close and could zoom into a portion of this book, a portion of this page, and I'll try to put a close-up of this on the next slide, you can see that the line work on this is absolutely exquisite, and there's just a tremendous amount of detail. What's also very interesting, you notice the different colors. There's sort of a pink color and a blue, and then on the inside of the cross there's like this green color and a red, and then there's these orange lines both inside and outside. If you just pick one of those colors, one of those lines, and if you could follow it with your eye, trace it with your finger, it continues completely unbroken within that quadrant. It's a continuous unbroken line completely wrapping its way around ever so intricately all over through here. So it's an incredible piece of work, a piece of artwork, drawing again specifically from that Celtic tradition. Now these carpet pages were primarily just decoration. They might mark a separation of the book into one section or another, but their primary purpose was just decorative. And you're really seeing a lot of expression here and a complete immersion in that Celtic tradition for these Christian motifs. And here we have a close-up detail, as I was mentioning, where you can really begin to appreciate the intricacy of this. The process of making an illuminated manuscript, no matter how decorated or not it was a very painstaking process, where it could take you quite a while just to prepare the pages and then the materials. Everything had to be laid out in advance before then the final lines and coloration and everything could be put into the piece. You can see the immense detail with the zoomorphic forms and how they interloop and intertwine with each other. So clearly the artist creating this is a highly skilled craftsman, somebody who would have had a great deal of experience not just creating illuminated manuscripts, but a great deal of experience with this particular kind of decorative motif. This is clearly somebody who had a long tradition, a long history, creating these kinds of knotwork patterns. Here's another example of a carpet page. This is from the famous Book of Kells. Some of you may have heard of that one before. This depicts the Kai Rho. We mentioned in previous lectures what the Kai Rho was and its importance to Christianity. And we're just seeing here, this is a page dedicated to that. In fact, it's so elaborate and there's so much going on here, it can be a little bit difficult to see the Chi and the Rho. And do take a moment, pause it if you have to see if you can pick out where those letters are. You'll notice as we look at this, there's just layer on layer of spirals and interlaced work. We see that there are all sorts of bright colors. There's golden ink in here as well. The golden ink, it probably goes without saying, that is real gold that they have to liquefy and put into the ink to create this. Painstakingly done. Now I want to focus on the manual labor and how difficult it is to create these sort of objects, because the mere fact that the church and these missionaries are spending so much time and effort on creating these objects immediately tells us how important they are. We don't spend that kind of manpower and resources and money on objects unless they are of extreme importance to the society. These missionaries will go out and create small monasteries. The monasteries themselves will be more or less independent little cities. They try to be as self-sufficient as possible. What the mission of those monks are depends on what order you're a part of. Some monasteries are very missionary oriented. They're going out trying to actively convert people. Other monasteries are much more contemplative and reflective, and the monks don't really interact with the outside world. It just depends on the particular order that people become involved with. As we'll see as we move through European medieval history, the role of these monasteries will become increasingly important in different European cities. Essentially, they will become, in certain European cities, the centers of commerce, the centers of education. Many of major European universities began as these early Christian monasteries. So they'll play an increasingly important role throughout the cultural and political dynamics of Europe. At this point, though, and this work comes from about the late to early 9th century, in Scotland, what we're going to see are the creation of these relatively small, precious objects of devotion and worship that will be an integral part of how Christianity is both establishing itself and spreading across these areas of Northern and Western Europe. Another type of image being developed in these Celtic areas, in the Hiberno-Saxon area, is what we typically refer to nowadays as the Celtic Cross. You may be familiar with the symbol. It's a Christian cross with that circle around it. This is another example of how these missionaries, Christian missionaries in the area, are adapting local symbols, pagan symbols, to Christian purposes. We believe that Celts in the area before Christianity used a type of cross symbol, like an X or a cross symbol with a circle around it, as a type of sun symbol in the worship of the sun in the sky. When Christian missionaries come into the area and trying to spread Christianity and monotheism into the region, they'll basically adapt and manipulate that symbol into something like what you see here, and superimpose a crucifix over that circle, explain to the local people that yes, it's sun worship, but it's not the sun in the sky, it's the Son of God, and we'll use it as a tool to try to convert people to Christianity. Obviously, I'm simplifying the story here, but this is how the Celtic cross, how that comes about, the provenance of that. Once it becomes acceptable to use that symbol in these areas, we'll see that it gets adapted all over Ireland and Scotland and England. So much so to the point what we see here, this is coming from about the year 923. This is called a high cross. It's a tomb marker. It is 18 feet tall. So it's quite a monumental piece. As you can see, it's got all kinds of depictions of Christ in judgment and the life of Jesus, very elaborately done. You'll notice that the depiction of the figures on the scene are sort of abstracted in that late Roman Empire style that we talked about at the collapse of the Roman Empire. So we're still using that kind of figural representation. And here we see the other side of that cross, where we see a crucifixion scene in the center. If you can see the crucifixion scene, that is a youthful, beardless Christ in the center, supported by scenes from the Passion underneath him. So we're still bringing all of that early Roman Christian symbolism and imagery to these outlying areas, but adapting them to the local population to make the faith more acceptable to the local population. So let's drop down from the British Isles down to France and take a look at what's happening here. So this graphic shows you the different factions of the Frankish Empire, what will become the Frankish Empire. What's important to understand about what we call France today is that back during the early medieval time, it was not at all a singular nation or a singular people. You can see in this map all of the different languages and ethnic groups, this sort of patchwork pattern that comes to being in France. So what's important to understand is if you live up in Saxony in the northern part, you consider yourself a Saxon, and you do not consider yourself a Swabian. You do not consider yourself a Burgundian. If you are a Burgundian, you consider yourself quite different from Bavarians or Saxons or Lombards or any of these other sort of groups in the region. We want to consider each of these areas basically like its own kingdom, its own sort of ethnic area. Now what's significant then, all of these areas are competing with each other, fighting with each other at various points for dominion over the whole region. And things are pretty much at a stalemate until we get this guy named Charlemagne. And Charlemagne is going to be primarily responsible for unifying what we think of as France, as well as the rest of Europe, into what we then call the Holy Roman Empire. So let's learn a little bit about who Charlemagne is. That name, Charlemagne, means Charles the Great. He was king of the Franks from about 768, and then emperor of the Romans from 800 to 814. So he's able to unify Frankish people as early as 768. He's then able to basically quell resistance in the rest of the region to become recognized as emperor of the Romans, the new Roman emperor, in the year 800. He will expand the Frankish kingdom into this vast empire, which will incorporate much of Western and Central Europe, and he will eventually, during his reign, conquer Italy. His rule is also associated with what we call the Carolingian Renaissance, which is a revival of art, religion, and culture through the medium of the Catholic Church. So keeping that in mind, let's move on to the next slide and take a look at what Charlemagne might have looked like. So here's an equestrian portrait of Charlemagne. We're going to call him Charlemagne. Some people wonder if he's actually Charlemagne or if he's one of Charlemagne's heirs, Charles the Bald. But for our sake, we're just going to call him Charlemagne. So as I said, he was expanding this new empire on the legacy of the ancient Roman Empire, and he styles himself in the manner of a Roman emperor. And we can see that with this statue. He's an equestrian portrait. He's on horseback in in the tradition of the great Roman emperors. He's using also the legitimacy of the Catholic Church. So, as you recall, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, we have a dispute over whether the capital of Christianity is in Rome or in Constantinople. We'll have the rise of the Byzantine Empire out of Constantinople. We'll get guys like Charlemagne who want to pick up the banner of Christianity from Rome, using the foundations of the old Roman Empire to do so. And he's basically able to eventually unify much of Europe, Central, Western, and Northern Europe, under the banner of what will eventually become known as the Holy Roman Empire. Clearly, Charlemagne wants to draw that connection between himself and the ancient Roman Empire. He was a brilliant military commander. He initiated many large-scale military conquests. He was promised several Iberian cities in return to giving military aid to various governors. There was a bit of political intrigue there when that deal will eventually be withdrawn. Subsequently, Charlemagne's retreating army will experience a pretty crushing defeat at the hands of the Basques at the Battle of Roncesvalles, which will be commemorated in the story The Song of Roland. So if you know anything about medieval literature, The Song of Roland is about Charlemagne's defeat. He will also campaign against the people to his east, particularly the Saxons, and after a very long war, will eventually subject them to his rule. Charlemagne will go into Saxon and Anglo areas, forcibly Christianizing them and banning on penalty of death any native German paganism. He will integrate them into his realm, which will eventually pave the way for the Ottonian dynasty that we'll talk about a little bit later. French and German monarchies descending from the empire ruled by Charlemagne as Holy Roman Empire will cover most of Europe. So as we take a look at this representation of him, we'll see him mounted on a horse, and you'll see that he's holding a sphere in his hand. Now, we saw that representation before. If you think back to Justinian and his representations in the Byzantine Empire, so that was coming from the 6th century, and this is coming from the 9th century. Same idea, the idea that the sphere represents the globe of the earth, and the idea that he, as a Christian emperor, will bring Christianity to the world and conquer the world in the name of Christ, all very much a part of the symbolism here. Now, what we'll also notice about this piece, though, is that it's not very big. It's only about 9.5 inches high. And what we'll see is that after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the classical Roman Empire, a great deal of the knowledge and the sophistication and the technology that was indicative of the empire collapses in this part of Europe, up in the north and west and so on. We no longer have the infrastructure, we no longer have the resources and the technology that we had in the classical era. So I'm sure Charlemagne would have loved to have had, a 12-foot tall statue of himself on a horse. We just don't have the resources or technology at this point to be able to do what the ancient Romans had done. But still, quite a nice piece regardless. And I have an image that will show us the other side. So here's just a brief look at the other side of that small statuette. Again, we'll notice Charlemagne has a crown on, and he's on his horse as a conquering general, bringing Christianity and unification across Europe. So under Charlemagne's rule in French and Germanic areas, we will also have the production of illuminated manuscripts, much like we saw in Hiberno-Saxon areas. The difference being that in Carolingian areas, during the Carolingian Renaissance, we'll notice that there is still a remarkable connection to the classical era. So in this page of St. Matthew, we see this opening book with a picture of St. Matthew writing down his own gospel here. This is coming from Aachen, Germany, clearly a part of the Germanic area of Charlemagne's empire. And we're seeing this very clear connection to Roman classicism. We have perspective, we have more naturalistic looking form. We can clearly see this figure seated before his bench writing the words down. We see a great deal of shading. We see perspective, even though he has this really massive halo behind him. So we're seeing that classical realism and some of those classical Roman elements being brought into this area as Charlemagne really wants to try to Romanize and Christianize this central part of Europe. So quite distinctively different, as you see, from what's happening in England and Ireland and Scotland at this time, where we're developing a distinctive style that melds local pagan artistic traditions with Christian iconography. Here we're trying to suppress the local traditions and the local motifs in favor of bringing this Romanized Christianity into the area. And here's a great example of another St. Matthew page. This is from the Ebo Gospels and dates from about 816, created in France. Where we'll see again a lot of classical elements, but also being blended with more linear traditions, which gives us something that's very unique. You're not going to see other gospel paintings that look quite like this. Something that's unusually expressionistic with a very loose line to it, a very loose gestural form. To our eyes, it looks kind of cartoonish, but with some fantastic detail and rendering going on here. So in some pockets of the Carolingian Empire, we will notice these little oddities where we're mixing and blending that Roman classicism with more local traditions, creating very expressive items like this. Illuminated Gospels, much like the pages we've been looking at, often had very elaborate covers that bound them. It's hard to get more ornate than this one here from the Lindau Gospels from up in Switzerland. This is made about the year 870. We see that it's gold, precious stones, pearls. It's quite a substantial piece. We see a crucifixion right in the center of it. But as you look at the crucified Jesus, you'll notice that he's being portrayed in that early Christian youthful manner with no beard and the long hair. So we're drawing from an early Christian tradition. Also an element of the Byzantine in there with that bright gold background. We see the other evangelist symbols around and then absolutely encrusted with these jewels and pearls. So obviously something like this is an incredibly elaborate, extremely expensive item to create. Something like this most likely was paid for by a local patron, a local king or feudal lord who would offer up the materials, the money to pay for something like this. Craftsmen then, maybe in the monastery, would create the object, and then it would be dedicated to the local church. So this is not something that would have been hanging out in a person's private home. More likely than not, this would have been a very special item on display and for use within the local cathedral, within the local church. Speaking of churches, it's during the Carolingian era that we'll actually see the development of large-scale churches in Western and Central Europe begin construction. So the last churches we looked at in the western part of Europe were in Italy, and they tended to be basilican plan, or they tended to be Byzantine-style central plans. What we'll notice during the Carolingian Renaissance are the construction of very large-scale churches, usually along some sort of basilican-type plan, again, because we want to reinforce that connection to Rome and Roman antiquity. What we're looking at here is in Corvey, Germany, and we are looking at the west facade, or the Westwerk, of the Abbey Church. This is unique to the Carolingian era. Well, I should say later on we will see westworks continue to be built, but they're developed specifically in the Carolingian era. It is simply a monumental western facade, usually with two towers on either side, and that's exactly what you see. This one is unique to us because it's the only surviving one original to the Carolingian Empire. Others were built, most don't survive. This is the only original Carolingian westwork we have left. So it dates to about 873 to about 885. As you can imagine, an extremely large building complex. To give us an idea of scale, because there aren't any people in this picture, if you look at the bottom, that central archway, through there is a doorway. That doorway is approximately 12 feet tall, to give us an idea of what kind of scale we're looking at. You'll see that it's highly symmetrical. One side mirrors the other. But other than that, we have a little bit of buttressing. There's really no exterior decoration. We don't see any statues. We don't see anything that's really elaborate on the portals. It's fairly stripped down, and we're just using the sheer scale of the architecture to communicate the power and presence of the church. Now, this will change. By the time we get to the Gothic era, in a few hundred years here, we'll see that attitudes about the decoration of a church will change dramatically, and we'll get some very elaborate exterior decoration. But for right now, we're concentrating on the size and the scale. And there's a very clear purpose to something like this. In the towers would be a couple of bells. Those could be sounded to alert the city of impending danger. These large churches could also be shelters in case of an attack, a military attack, or in case of extreme weather, something like that. People could seek refuge here, as well as, of course, being a house of worship, a place where people went to worship on the Sabbath. So all of those things combined will help to establish Christianity, in particular Roman Catholicism, as the primary presence and the most dominating presence within the city. Buildings like these in the 800s, as you can imagine, were by far the largest building, not just in the town, but probably for dozens and dozens of miles. You could see these things from miles away. All of that is communicating something about the power, the presence, and the authority of the church. So as we look at the interior of this place, a different church, but also up in German areas, we'll need to consider what happens after Charlemagne's death. Charlemagne dies in the year 814. He has several heirs, and they cannot get along. They fight with each other, and they basically divvy up the empire into quadrants and try to rule independently in their different quadrants. But they're not happy with that, and the brothers start fighting each other. And basically, everything that Charlemagne built over about 40 years of rule, his heirs completely tear apart within about a decade. It's really only, we have to wait until the mid-10th century that we get another ruler who comes in, who's able to stabilize things enough to sort of resume what Charlemagne had started. And that will be Otto I, from Germanic areas, so he's a Germanic ruler. He will be able to come in, and he has the ability and the military and the resources to stabilize Europe again under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire. Otto I will rule out of the city of Rome from about 936 to about 973. So he's ruling in the city of Rome and definitely wants to locate himself, like Charlemagne, in the tradition of the Roman emperors. Charlemagne, however, did not rule in Rome. He thought Rome was important, but he didn't like living there. He lived up in Germany, up in Aachen. But Otto understands that Rome is an important symbol to Christianity, and he wants to closely identify himself with that area. Now, as we look at this, the interior of this church up in Germany, this is coming from this early Ottonian empire, this Ottonian era. We'll see that it's basically a modified early Christian basilica, made much, much wider, and we're seeing a great deal more height and emphasis on this massive interior space. And this will become quite the trend for our cathedral churches throughout Europe. We see another example of a basilican plan Ottonian church here at St. Michael's in Hildesheim, Germany. So again, the basilican plan is coming from a Roman tradition. Early Christian churches in Rome tended to be basilican. And what we'll see here is just a continuation of that Roman idea made larger on a much bigger scale. And this again will be a trend that we will see here during this Ottonian era. And the churches will get bigger and bigger throughout the Romanesque, which is next week, and then bigger and bigger in the Gothic, until we just sort of max out how large we can build these structures. So although the exterior of these buildings are fairly plain, not a lot of exterior decoration, there are precious artifacts and there are large-scale decorative pieces being placed inside them. And this is a great example. This is also from St. Michael's in Hildesheim. This was created about the year 1015. These are bronze doors that would have been a part of the interior, and they're quite substantial. These doors are about 16.5 feet tall. You can see the large panels that have scenes on them, and I'll show you a diagram of what the scenes are. But they're scenes from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they mirror each other in such a way as to allow for a reading across these testaments in that idea of prefiguration that we talked about before. So let's take a look at a diagram of these of the messages, and then we'll take a look at some details of the door. So here's a layout of those doors, and you can see how the placement of the figures relate to each other. So on the left-hand side, we have scenes from Genesis in the Old Testament, and on the right-hand side, we have scenes from the Gospels in the New Testament. We read the left-hand door from top to bottom, where we begin with the creation of Adam, and we end with Abel being murdered by Cain. And then on the right-hand side, we read from bottom to top, where we begin with the Annunciation, and then we end with the ascension of Christ to heaven. We'll see, and I like this little diagram because it sort of spells everything out for us. At the very, very top, with the creation of Adam juxtaposed against the ascension, we see this idea of paradise lost versus paradise gained. The next panel down, we see Eve being presented to Adam across from the scene of the women at the tomb of Jesus. So we get this idea of greetings. Then down from that, we have the temptation and fall right across from the crucifixion. So we have this idea of the original sin, the tree of knowledge, being juxtaposed against the tree of life, which is the cross and salvation. And you can see this very clear one-to-one relationship that church officials want to make as part of the narrative of Christianity, using the Old Testament as a prefiguration of the New Testament to help create continuity between those halves of the book. Now, we're looking at a text form of this. None of this text is actually on the door, of course. These are all pictorial representations. It is important to remember that the people of the city of Hildesheim at this time, for the most part, most of the population is going to be illiterate. So they're not going to have access to be able to read the Gospels or read these interpretations. They're going to rely on elaborate pictorial representations to try to understand the concepts and the theology, and of course having the priests and the monks and whatnot interpret and explain it to them. But a pretty clever use here of typology and a clever use of juxtaposition of imagery to make these theological points. Let's take a quick look at some details of the actual figures. So as we look at this scene, a close-up of the fall of Adam and Eve, there's something about these panels that has a wonderful sort of naive charm to them. First of all, we'll notice immediately that any sort of classical realism, depth, and perspective, that's completely gone. The figures are that sort of abstracted, late Roman Empire style, with the large heads and the stunted arms and legs on sort of these large torsos. They're completely out of proportion. There are no backgrounds to speak of in these images. You barely have a ground line that the figures are stepping on. Any of that classical realism and movement and motion that we saw in the classical era, it's completely gone from here. In spite of that, however, there is a certain level of emotion and charm within these pieces. These are massive bronze doors, but you can see that the panels themselves have a really rough-hewn look to them. They look very handmade as you look at how uneven the lines are, how wobbly the borders are around the scene. What's happening in this scene, the figure on the far left, that's God in the Garden of Eden. And it's a really remarkable piece. Here we see God represented in human form. He has a halo. He has a cross. Now, according to the narrative of Christianity, this is before Jesus is sent to earth. But we see a prefiguration of that idea with the cross on God's halo. He's holding a book that represents the written law. And you see he's pointing sternly at Adam. He's accusing Adam of breaking the laws of the Garden of Eden. You see that Adam there, the central figure, because he is taken of the fruit of knowledge, is now ashamed of his nakedness and is covering himself with a leaf. But if you follow his other arm, he has his arm under his other arm, and he's pointing behind him to Eve, and he's basically passing the blame. So God's pointing at Adam. Adam's pointing at Eve, who's on the far right, and Eve is pointing at the serpent. So each one is trying to blame someone else for their transgression. All for naught, of course, they will be cast out of paradise. Really wonderful representation of the serpent as this weird, grotesque hybrid creature at the bottom. And here's a look at another scene from the doors, a different part of the narrative. Of course, this is the birth of Jesus, a nativity scene where you see Jesus being held between Mary and Joseph. Again, we see that awkward use of anatomy, the awkward use of the bodies. The lines and the way the cloth is being rendered here is very similar to what we saw in Byzantine eras, that sort of flat, patterned look. But we clearly don't have an interest here in trying to pursue a great deal of realism. We're keeping these bodies very abstracted. Now there's some great depth here. We saw in the last slide, and we see it here, the heads of these figures are pulled away from the background. And how these would have been positioned on the door, in some cases quite high up on the door. And so we'll see that the figures are sometimes artificially popped out away from the door to make sure that people who are standing, in some cases 10 feet beneath where these would have been, could clearly see the faces and clearly see what the narrative is. So the church in Hildesheim doesn't just have those amazing doors, it also has this piece. This is a column. This is not architectural. It's not meant to hold up a wall, it's just a freestanding column. You could almost think of it like the column of Trajan we saw in the Roman Empire. It's a commemorative memorial type of piece. Now, it's not nearly as large as the column of Trajan. This is only 12.5 feet tall. But it is cast out of bronze, so that's pretty amazing that we would have access to this much raw material. It's showing scenes from the life of Christ. It unfolds in a spiral narrative, a continuous narrative going from top to bottom, where we see all of the important scenes of the life of Christ lined up for us. Let's take a look at a close-up of this. So in this close-up, you can see some more of the figures and what's going on as Jesus goes through the important phases of his life, wrapping up this column. What's interesting about the composition of this piece, and you can see it in this figure, you'll notice that Jesus is represented in line with himself going up the piece. So at the bottom you see Jesus in the center, and he's clearly indicated by that big halo with a cross. Immediately above him is another representation of him in another scene. And then above him is another representation of him in another scene. If we could see further up the column, we would see that when you stand in the right spot to look at this, you see the highlights, if you will, of these important events in Jesus' life. They all line up on this axis. Now, I've read various scholars who have interpreted this in a particular way. One scholar has suggested that we could sort of think of this in a similar way to like a movie trailer. There's a whole story, like an entire movie narrative being told in this spiral as it wraps around the piece. However, if you just stand in this one spot and look at just these scenes, that's like a movie trailer. It's showing you the highlights. It's showing you the exciting moments, the important moments, the dramatic moments, all lined up in one look. And it's really interesting to think about the narrative in that way, that the artists were thinking about how a person would just stand still in front of this piece, how they would read it, and they're clearly composing how the scene unfolds, how the narrative unfolds to maximize the drama of this particular way of looking at it. It's a really fascinating way to look at this particular object. So we'll move away from Hildesheim to go to the Cologne Cathedral to take a look at this piece. One of our first large-scale crucifixes that we can look at in the Christian era. And this is a large piece. He's about 6'2". This is created in about the year 790 for the Archbishop Garrow, and so we tend to refer to this as the Garrow Crucifix. What's also unique about this piece is that it is a fairly naturalistic representation of Christ. He's not abstracted or flattened out in this piece. He's got a great three-dimensionality to him. It's a very expressive and emotional piece where we really see this idea of the suffering that this type of death, crucifixion, inflicts on the body. You can see there's fantastic detail in the skin. You can actually see the muscle and how taut the skin is being pulled with the weight of the body. So very remarkable in terms of its naturalism, and that we actually get a sense of a real body and the weight of the figure hanging off of this cross. So that's going to be a unique piece for this era in terms of its realism. We're wanting to, again, try to connect to that Roman classicism and bring in an element of emotion and expressionism to the piece. So what we're noticing is that art during the Ottonian reign tends to be kind of a hybrid art, wanting to connect to that Roman Empire feel, but also bringing in other elements. And so here we've come back to an illuminated manuscript. This is the Annunciation of the Shepherds from the Lectionary of Henry II. This is again from up in Germany, created about the year 1002 to 1014. We have tempera on vellum, and we have this, again, very expressive piece that's going to combine some elements of late antique landscapes. If you remember our mosaics from late antiquity, the early Christian era, we see a lot of similarities there to the landscape here. We see this idea of Carolingian anecdotal narratives with the story of the Annunciation to the shepherds, complete with Byzantine-style abstraction, flattening of the shape, patterning of the cloth, and that bright, flat, golden background, which is very Byzantine in its style. So Ottonian era artwork tended to be a hybrid of all of these different influences coming into Central and Western Europe. So the Ottonian era follows through several eras, including this guy, Otto III, where we're getting an idea of how the Holy Roman Emperor styles himself. So this is dating from about 997 to about the year 1000. And here we see Otto III. He abstracted, not unlike representations we've seen with the Byzantine emperors, but if anything, he's a bit more abstract than our Byzantine representations. He's very, very flat, very distorted in the bodies and the arms and the legs. We do see him enthroned. We see he's holding a very tall staff. He's wearing a crown. He again is holding that sphere, that globe. We saw Justinian with that. We saw Charlemagne with that. So that clear continuity of this idea of ruling the globe. He is in the center. You'll notice that on either side, on our left, are a couple of priests. So we see the authority of the church. And then on the right, we see a couple of soldiers with their arms and armor. So we see that clearly Otto styles himself as the center of both the church and the military, and that he's going to rule with the right of both of those things. That he is the emperor and the pope. He is the center of both civic life and religious life. He is the head of the church and the head of the state, all wrapped up into one. And it's just a beautifully painted book, really bright and vibrant, gorgeously done. So that will conclude this week's look at the early medieval era, and to help set us up for next week, I'll bring back my favorite timeline. So next week we'll be covering roughly the area circumscribed by that yellow circle, the Romanesque. That's going to coincide, as you can see, with the Great Schism, the Crusades, the eventual sack of Constantinople, and we'll be moving along this axis of history here. And we're going to begin to see eventually the development of Western and Central Europe into those kingdoms that we typically associate with the medieval era. We don't really see organized, sophisticated kingdoms and structures like that until about after about the year 1000, after the Crusades. The Crusades are going to bring a lot of money and a lot of prestige into Europe that's going to help form the foundation of some of those kingdoms. We will also see that centralized government of the Holy Roman Empire that Charlemagne and the Ottonians helped to build and define. That will begin to wane. That will begin to crumble in power and prestige as our French kings, Spanish kings, English kings, as they begin to rise in power contra the Holy Roman Emperor and contra the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. And this will cause its own problems and its own divisions. Lots of politics happening during this medieval time. But we will get to all of that next week. So if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me, and I will try to address those problems as quickly as possible. You can find my email address on the Blackboard website. Until then, thank you very much, and I will talk at you next week.